Good evening, everyone. I'm Zoe Daniel, the member for Goldstein. Welcome to the Glen Ira Town Hall for this sold-out event on The Voice. We are, of course, on Bunurong Bunwarang country in the Kulin Nation tonight, and I welcome all of you here. Before we begin this very important conversation, and I really do appreciate all of you coming for this reasonable discussion that we're going to have, I'd like to introduce Janet Galpin from the Bunwarang Land and Sea Council for the Welcome to Country. Thanks, Janet.
Thank you, Zoe, for the introduction. Wominjeka. Wominjeka is the Bunwarang language word for come with purpose. And it's your purpose this evening to be here for this forum with Indigenous leader Thomas Mayo and Kerry O'Brien, acclaimed journalist, who've published the Voice to Parliament handbook. So thank you to all of you for your keen interest in this groundbreaking topic. And this evening it's my purpose to deliver a welcome to country. So welcome to all of you and welcome to our beautiful country, land of the two bays and Bunwarang country. I'm direct descendant from our First Peoples and cousin to Nawit, Dr. Carolyn Briggs AM, the elder of the Bunwarang and Yarlakat Whelan clan, the lands of where we're meeting here tonight. I'm also obviously of Irish and English descent. Today we meet on the country of our ancestors and we pay our respect, not just today, but always to our ancestors, those people who came before us. And we're especially pleased to recognise the commitment that you've made here tonight in paying respect to the spirit of this land and to our First Peoples. Through this, you have shown the willingness to honour sacred ground. For the past over 200 years, we have been largely ignored and all but written out of the history of our great nation, Australia. So when I get the chance, I like to recap some of our history that we want to have a shared history with you. We are the oldest living, surviving culture in the world, and this is something that we want all Australians and peoples of other countries to connect to. Australia also has the world's oldest oral stories. Our First Peoples engraved the world's first maps and made the earliest paintings of ceremony, and the very first footprints on this continent were those belonging to our First Peoples. First Nations people across Australia all share a special connection to the lands and the waters of their ancestors that has not been disconnected from the millennia, despite dispossession, displacement, discrimination, poisonings, massacres, the forced removal of children from their families, and near genocide that we have experienced over the last 200 plus years, and all of it government sanctioned. This is the real history of this country, a very shameful past that has resulted in intergenerational trauma for our mob. This has been our reality, and we say it's time that we as a nation say enough. Enough is enough. Give our people a voice. I beg the question, will we be finally listened to with a voice? But in regards to having a voice, it's no use unless it is listened to. And we appear to be in a political climate where that might become a reality. So we ask that you recognise and celebrate that our First Nations people have occupied and cared for this continent for well over 65,000 plus years. And we invite all Australians and all peoples of other countries that are here with us tonight to embrace the ancient history of this country, a history that dates back thousands of generations. And this includes the Bunwarang, who are the original inhabitants of this their country. Our Bunwarang people today still live and work on country. And according to tradition, this land has always been protected by our creator Bunjil, who travels as an eagle. And our waterways are protected by Wa, who travels as a crow. Bunjil taught the Bunwarang to always welcome guests, but he requires the Bunwarang to ask all visitors to make two promises I ask of you here this evening, and that's to obey two of the laws of Bunjil. The first one, to not harm the land of Bunjil, and the second, to not harm the children of this beautiful land. If we can commit ourselves to just these two promises, we live in a better world. Nunkudshin. Have a fabulous evening, everyone.
And thank you to the legendary Janet Galpin for that welcome. And welcome to this sellout event, a joint event with my friend, Community Independent Member for Kooyong, Monique Ryan. Welcome to Thomas Mayo and Kerry O'Brien, authors of the excellent and informative handbook on the voice. It says a lot, I think, that this book has been top of the bestseller list in recent weeks. A sign, I think, that there is a thirst for information about this profoundly important step in our development as a democracy, this opportunity for positive change that we, or more to the point, you, hold today. The key question is, I think, who are we and who do we want to be? What legacy do we want to leave our children? Business as unfinished as the failures to comprehensively address climate change, to lead with integrity and to ensure equality for women, which were among the drivers of the results that put both Monique and I into the Federal Parliament. Shall we, the group of us in this room tonight, lead with optimism and aspiration to unite our nation, or shall we promote fear and pessimism? We often tell our children to be the change you want to see, to be brave. So I join the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who've met over decades and together developed this intentional plan for constitutional recognition. Recognition that is not radical, recognition that exists and has existed for years in similar countries across the world, while here in Australia, in this great southern land of such exquisite beauty and ancient history, there is no recognition of First Nations people in the Constitution. And I accept their respectful request for a voice, a simple voice, to give advice to MPs like me, like Mon, on the issues that affect them. On education, on housing, on healthcare, on deaths in custody, on young people in custody, on employment and more. In this, we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Anyone who tells you there'll be another chance soon enough is being disingenuous. Given the infrequency of referenda in this country, I firmly believe this is our one chance to get this done. We can do this with optimism and grace, not only for Indigenous children, but for our own children and their collective future. This once-in-a-generation referendum rests on the framework of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and its 3 pillars: voice, treaty, truth. From where I stand, the referendum is about 3 principles: respect, recognition, results. Practical, tangible results to close the gap for First Nations communities. Respect for a generous invitation from our First Nations people. Recognition, and overdue recognition at that, for their custodianship of this great continent. Recognition that we are responsible for the current policies that leave our Indigenous citizens with well-being that leaves them so far behind the prosperity the rest of us enjoy. Results. Practical results to succeed where all current and previous efforts have failed to bridge the gap. As the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Linda Burney, reminded us at the National Press Club a few days ago, just 4 of the 19 closing the gap targets are on track. It is a challenge to us all, for example, that one of the key measures of infant health, a baby's birth weight, is getting worse, as are the incarceration rates of Indigenous Australians and suicide. These 3 things are emblems of entrenched disadvantage that begins before an Indigenous child is born. Why are we tolerating this? If not from a social, cultural and moral perspective, from a financial and economic one. We're constantly throwing good money at entrenched failure. If only there was a way to get direct advice from those experiencing this disadvantage to support better targeted approaches. Yes? If policies instituted from the top down have failed so comprehensively, Indigenous Australians are simply asking us to allow them to provide advice from the ground up, to provide advice based on their lived experience. It is a simple request that deserves a simple answer: to recognise the soaring history of Indigenous Australians in our Constitution and to give them a voice. It's my pleasure now to introduce the member for Kooyong, Monique Ryan, to also say a few words.
Thank you very much, Zoe, and I should acknowledge that I come from the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation, and that those lands were never ceded. It's a great pleasure to be with you tonight. And firstly, I wanted to acknowledge the incredible generosity of Thomas and Kerry in spending their time with us this evening. They have been working incredibly hard. In the last few months, we've seen a small, dedicated, brave, tireless group of people proselytising about the voice. More and more of us have come on board with our impressions of what we feel needs to happen. What we're trying to do tonight, and in the many meetings that we're holding in our own communities, is to talk to people in a respectful, intelligent way about important questions. Things which will determine what Australia looks like, not next year, not in 10 years' time, but in 15, 25, 50 years' time. As a middle-aged Australian woman, I've seen the gaps increase in my lifetime. As a doctor who's worked in the Northern Territory, I've seen the effects of poverty, alcoholism, intergenerational abuse on all of the outcomes that we hold dear as a country. The definition of madness is repeating the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. We have as a country to face this incredible challenge, and we have an opportunity this year to do that. The settlers and the colonists have been here for 235 years. And when we formed our constitution, we didn't actually pay attention to the fact that there were people who'd been here for 65,000 or more. This year we have a chance to remedy that. There are many discussions that need to be had by every person in this room if you walk out of here at the end of this evening convinced that the voice is a good idea, with 5, 10 or 15 other people. It's up to us. What we've seen in the last few months since the Prime Minister announced the referendum is people who will seek to widen the gaps, people who will seek to find cracks and exploit them within our society. The language that they have used has in some instances been incredibly hurtful and insulting, and I think that we are as a country better than that. It is on all of us, each of us, to remedy that problem. Not everyone has to vote yes, but every person who votes in the referendum in October has the responsibility to understand the decision that they're making, and not just vote yes because they don't quite get it or they don't quite feel comfortable with it. They need to understand why they're making the decision that they're making. And what I hope that we'll do tonight is to allow each of you a chance to ask the questions that you need to ask in order to feel comfortable about the decision that you make. I thank you for coming, and I ask you to listen well and ask lots of questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mon. So a couple of logistics. I will play the role of moderator and manage a conversation between these three for roughly the next half hour, and then we'll take about half an hour of questions. I welcome those who are online. We do have a live stream of this event, which was sold out, so thank you also for being here virtually. And you can ask your questions via the Slido app if you'd prefer not to get up to the microphone if you're in the room, but also if you're online. So if you Google Slido, and the number is 489-7908, and I'll repeat that a few times during the discussion, but for those online, the number is 489-7908, that's the code. Thomas Mayo is a Torres Strait Islander man born on Larrakia country in Darwin. Thomas became a wharf labourer from the age of 17 and then a union official for the Maritime Union of Australia, gaining skills of negotiating and organising in the union movement, and then applied those skills to advancing the rights of Indigenous people, becoming a signatory and tireless campaigner for the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Following the Uluru Convention, Thomas was entrusted to carry the sacred canvas of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and embarked on an 18-month journey around the country to garner support for a constitutionally enshrined First Nations voice and a Makarrata Commission for Truth-Telling and Agreement-Making or Treaties. Thomas is the author of Finding the Heart of the Nation, Dear Son, and the children's books Finding Our Heart and Freedom Day. There are a selection of books on the table here, including the one that Kerry and Thomas have written together. Kerry O'Brien, as I'm sure most of you would know, is one of my former ABC colleagues, a greatly respected journalist with 6 Walkley Awards, including the Gold Walkley and a Walkley for Outstanding Leadership, for his reporting and presenting on trailblazing current affairs programs, including This Day Tonight and Four Corners, Late Line and 7:30. He's been inducted into the Television Industry Hall of Fame, but relevant to this subject, Kerry has covered all the big historic Indigenous issues of his time, including land rights, deaths in custody, Mabo, the Stolen Generations Inquiry, the birth and death of ATSIC, the intervention and the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and he was a member of the eminent panel advising the Queensland Government on a path to treaty. And of course, the final member of our panel tonight is Monique Ryan, the member for Kooyong. Please welcome them all. Okay, this is going to be speed dating, I think, because I have lots of questions, so will Mon, and then we really do want to get to some questions from the floor. So, Thomas, let's go to the book, the handbook to the Voice to Parliament. How did you come together to write this, and what does it say about the state of the debate that you thought it was needed?
Yeah, well, firstly, that's very... my voice just... anyway. No, firstly... over the 6 years or 5 years until there was finally a commitment to it from the Albanese government, I realised pretty early that it was not something, you couldn't take it for granted that people would know how to advocate for this. Even people that were seasoned, campaigners struggled because this was an issue that was an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issue, so they wanted to get things right. There were nuances to it. And so during COVID, actually, I developed a training course. During COVID, trained around 2,000 union members in how to advocate for the voice. 2 3-hour sessions over 2 days. And so, I understood that I had to help people to understand how they could help us. When we had the commitment for the referendum from Albanese, I thought that I needed to write a handbook, something just brief and simple and small that people could use in their advocacy to help us to win the referendum. But I was running out of time. I didn't really make it happen because, pretty busy and everything. It was around, I always get the dates wrong here, Kerry's grimacing already. I think it was around September.
No.
No, it wasn't September. Okay.
It was late October.
Late October. Well, I had
Have
decided.
to write it on a big card, Thomas.
You didn't let me finish. It was September when I thought I need a co-author. I need a co-author to help me get this done. And so I thought, geez, Kerry would be perfect for this. I wanted a non-Indigenous co-author because this is about all Australians. I wanted to get at least some diversity into this book. And in October, I invited Kerry. It took about 48 hours to consider joining me, and he said yes. And so we met with the publisher, Hardy Grant, in November. I'm starting to get it right now. Right. It's only taken every capital city around the country to start to get it right. And they gave us a deadline of December to do the first draft. No, December? Yes, it was December. Yeah. Anyway.
A month.
So always ask a journalist when you're trying to do something on a tight deadline, I think is the lesson in that. Kerry, what does it say about us as a society that the voice has become such a divisive issue?
I think it's less what it says about us as a society than what it says about the state of our politics. And I might add that the biggest media proprietor in this country, over time, over decades, has honed a commercial business model, which we now see in practice with the effects it's having on Britain, particularly on America and here, which is, I think, built on division, built on creating friends and enemies, good and bad, black and white, everything simple, everything reduced, shades of grey discarded, and creating fear and exploiting prejudice. And I think that's what we're seeing here. I think that politically, I would actually welcome a respectful, honest debate about this incredibly important, pivotal moment in our history. Because I've been a part of a process in journalism for most of my life, which is about promoting precisely that, about taking the truth, understanding the issues, reporting them faithfully, analysing them and debating them. That is what our democracy is supposed to be about. But what it has descended into, I mean, there's always been elements of that. Always been elements of that. We've had some very divisive periods in our history before now. But I think that there are a number of elements at play here. There is the Australian version of the Trump effect. There's social media. People can exploit social media in all kinds of ways. The sort of hidden hand of manipulation that goes on. The anonymity behind which people hide. Cowards, I think, the coward's way. To hide your identity, to get poison out there and watch the dissent that comes, to watch the confusion that you sow and not care about its outcome or actually want its outcome. So, to me, what we are seeing in these last weeks particularly, as we've got closer to the deadline on the referendum, is an extremely disappointing and disturbing aspect of where we find ourselves as a society and as a democracy. And I think this is a huge test for us all.
Mon, you and I have sat in the Parliament and watched the tone of the debate. Obviously, we were both elected as community independents on a platform of doing politics differently. Can you see a way of bringing this back to community in order to change the framing of this conversation to take it forward?
I can, Zoe, and in fact that's one of the things that gives me hope is the fact that in May last year, Australia showed us that they want communities to have a voice. And thanks. And in many instances, that's why we're there, because in many instances people said, no, we've had enough of politics done the same way. We want it done differently. And so in a number of electorates, that was the choice that they made. And I think we're going to see the same thing here. And we always talk, the independents, about radical hope and the possibilities of that. And I think that's how we have to win this one. Because the major parties, I was on the radio on the way here, so they were saying it's like two seagulls fighting over a hot chip when behind them the sea is boiling. It's become politicised. The government can't escape from that. They're stuck in this horrible vortex where every time they try to say something, the opposition is saying, nah, it's the opposite. You know, it's so difficult for them, and they don't seem able to extricate themselves, and so it's up to us. And I think we can do it, but it's going to take a lot of work in a relatively short space of time, which is why we really have to mobilise communities.
And I'll stay with you for a moment, but communities like Kooyong and indeed Goldstein were among the strongest supporters of marriage equality. Yet the Liberals are citing polling in Kooyong showing that no supporters outnumber yes supporters. Do we believe that polling? And if so, what do we take from that?
Yeah, so Senator James Patterson keeps polling all sorts of odd questions in my electorate. I think he needs to get out a bit more. But actually, interestingly, this week, I think all the Libs are away, so he's actually Minister for Everything, I think. He's commenting on everything this week. But no, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. But I do think that there's an issue with the conversation. And I do think the government has not prosecuted its arguments effectively. And so when we're door knocking on the streets of Kooyong, which lots of members of my wonderful team who are here tonight have been doing, what we're hearing is not, we're against it, it's like we don't get it.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge. That's what we have to overcome.
Okay, so without embarrassing anyone, and you don't have to put your hand up, but do we have undecideds in the room tonight? If you're undecided, are you prepared to put your hand up? Okay. Do we have no?
I bet there's a tiny few more.
Do we have no votes in the room? Is everyone else a yes vote? If you're a yes vote, put up your hand. Okay, that's a better picture. And we'll have a conversation about this a little further, but you are part of the process. And I think Mon and I are absolutely aligned in the fact that this has to go from the parliamentary floor to community, and we have some things that we can talk to you about a bit later. Thomas, I want to come back to you about the fundamentals of this. So how much is the voice about past policy failures, and how much is it about the future?
Yeah, well, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is the consensus that came from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in 2017, is completely informed by the past. We had an eye to the past as we look to the future, because you have to understand the lessons that come from our elders. We needed to, we had an obligation to our people, firstly to propose something that was possible, but also powerful. And we couldn't ignore that we needed to establish a voice, because when you don't have one, you're exploited, you're ignored, you're easily divided. That's the present situation, and it's the reason why the gap gets worse. But we needed to do it differently, and that is to enshrine it in the Constitution and invite the Australian people to come on this journey with us to achieve it. So as far as the future goes, it's also all about the future. The whole reason that we have put ourselves out there, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, merely 4% of the population, and in a vulnerable way asked you to basically decide if we should have a say and if we should be recognised, is because we want a better future for our children. It's because we know that they need this healing first before we can heal ourselves, because otherwise good decisions just aren't being made about us. Self-determination is the way forward, and that's what we want for our children.
There are two...
Thank you.
There's a chapter in the book that looks at the history of previous attempts for Indigenous people to have a voice, a real voice that was being listened to in the National Parliament and in the halls of government. And it paints a frustrating and at times bleak picture. And that is that after the 1967 referendum, when the federal parliament and the government of the day, the Holt government, woke up one morning and thought, my God, we've suddenly got responsibility for Indigenous affairs. What do we do with it? In fact, the Minister for Territories, who was given the role, was asked 2 months after the referendum, what did they have in mind? He said, I don't know. And Harold Holt, as Prime Minister, decided he had to do something, so he appointed 3 people as the first voice on behalf of Indigenous Australians to him as Prime Minister, and ensconced them in his office. They were 3 white men. One was a trained diplomat, one was a former head of the Reserve Bank, and the other, at least somewhat fortunately, was an anthropologist who at least had some deep white perspective knowledge on Indigenous history and culture. And from there the Whitlam government came along and they established the first real Indigenous voice inside the Parliament. There had been all those voices of activists for many decades beforehand, but the first Indigenous voice to the Parliament with 41 elected representatives, but they were from within Indigenous communities, so genuinely representative, but they were butting their heads up against white bureaucrats, white politicians, who'd never actually had to contemplate listening to an Indigenous person ever. The bureaucrats particularly, imagine suddenly having this whole extra component, a people who had been ignored from the time Phillip, to the extent that they could be ignored, from the time Phillip planted the flag. So what happened was that Gough goes, Malcolm comes in, Malcolm changes the body, gives it a different name, reduces the numbers, changes the voting rules. He goes, Hawke comes in, 2 years later, he scraps what Malcolm had, and it takes him several years. In fact, it took him 4 years to establish ATSIC, but at least when he did, it was a real body, which in many ways was extremely effective, did some very good things, and in fact became a nursery for a whole new generation, a whole big new generation of Indigenous leadership. It did some great things, ATSIC, but from the time John Howard came in and replaced Hawke, or replaced Keating, ATSIC was on borrowed time because he had voted against it in opposition. He'd called it a black parliament. He very clearly didn't like it, made that plain, but it took 6 years, at least 6 years, for him to actually move on it. And when he did, it was because the opportunity came when the opposition leader of that time, Mark Latham, announced that Labor would be supportive of abolishing ATSIC. So despite the fact that a review process that was actually initiated by John Howard, led by a former Liberal Attorney General from New South Wales, and the entire press gallery just assumed that was the end of ATSIC, but that review process came back with a serious, strong recommendation that ATSIC was worth keeping, but that its ties with the regions had loosened and needed to be strengthened, but it should stay. Howard scrapped it. And the checkerboard that followed that was one that really produced no substantial results, no consistency, and so the one continuity in relation to Indigenous affairs through all those decades was that far more often than not, when Indigenous policy was set, without really ever listening to Indigenous people, except in part of that ATSIC period, policies were implemented and failed. Money was wasted, the gaps grew. They weren't really measured until after Rudd came in, but the gaps grew. And the other chapter of the book is where Marcia Langton and Fiona Stanley, 2 people with deep knowledge of the good things that have taken place around Indigenous communities in some of these fundamental areas like health and so on. They've got a rather short chapter, but packed with some great examples of where Indigenous policy has actually worked to great effect, and guess what? It's because Indigenous people have been listened to.
Tom, I want to come back to you, but I do want to sort of frame a question around it, which is that there appears to be a confusing message at the core of the voice conversation, which is, put crudely, that on the one hand, entrenching the voice in the Constitution won't really change anything for most people, but on the other hand, that it will change everything. That's a difficult sell. Is there a problem with framing it that way?
No, I don't think there's a problem with framing it that way. In that, I mean, there's nothing to lose for anybody. Should we vote yes to establish this voice in the Constitution, but everything to gain, you know. So for all Australians, we gain over 60,000 years of shared heritage and culture. You know, and what a great gift that is for our children, for future generations to be unique in the world, to be able to celebrate that. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we gain a voice, and as Kerry was saying, all of the evidence shows that the best outcomes are when we have that. And that's something for all Australians to gain as well, you know, that we will no longer be the only country that, the country that proportionately has the most incarcerated people on the planet, and that is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That we don't have this gap of almost 10 years difference in life expectancy. That we don't have these terrible suicide rates and all the rest. You know, that we can actually protect country and really care for country in a way that is so well informed because of the great knowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have about that. I mean, isn't that something for all of us to gain? You know, there is nothing to lose and everything to gain for all of us.
Do you think that just sort of prosecuting my earlier point, though, that we're in some ways cancelling out voters at both ends of the spectrum, those who are scared of too much change and those who think this won't create enough change. So they end up in that sort of middle ground of this isn't going to work.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at who are really strongly prosecuting those arguments. You know, you've got the extreme ends of politics. And I think the middle here, it shows that we've got the balance right here, right? I mean, but let's break it down to what this actually is, right? In the most simplest way. What we're voting on here, and if you look at the 92 words that will go into the Constitution if this succeeds, is recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the First Peoples by ensuring that they have a voice to make representations on matters that relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and the Parliament decides the rest. That's it. Nothing about a right to veto, nothing about a third chamber to Parliament, nothing about Indigenous people deciding where submarines are parked or what parking ticket fines should be. You know, it's advisory. May make representations. May make representations. The government doesn't have to take our advice, but you think that they would after it is driven from the grassroots, you know, from the people that are most affected by these decisions, through representatives that they choose, not politicians that political parties choose, but representatives that we choose, where we can transparently see what they're saying on our behalf, not meetings behind closed doors, that the Australian people can see what they're saying on our behalf, and then our democracy is enhanced because we will be able to judge on if they have listened to us and done as we have said as Australians in this referendum, which is to respect and act on what Indigenous people say about the decisions about them.
Mon. And I'm happy to start taking some questions in a moment. I think we do have a standing mic, and those who are on Slido online, you can put your questions into the app. How do you feel, Mon, about being on the receiving end of the kind of advice that Thomas is talking about as an MP?
Well, you know, I was a medical scientist in my previous life, and I think I knew then, and as I know from my being a human being with a family and children and all the other things, that you get better outcomes when you listen to people when they tell you what they need. In almost everything you do, if you're working on something and you're making a decision that's going to affect people's lives, why wouldn't you give them a chance to have some input into that? It's kind of as simple as that. It's such a modest proposal in so many ways that we're just giving people a chance to have input into decisions which in some instances will have a really significant impact on their lives. We've seen how we've got it wrong for such a long time. The model is clearly broken in many instances. Why wouldn't we try to improve it in a way which seems very clearly, just instinctively to be appropriate? It's being made out to so many Australians that we're losing something, that we're giving something up in establishing a voice. But in everything that we do in Parliament, we get advice from the experts.
Well, we do.
Well, we do.
That just came out, sorry.
We do. We do. So why wouldn't we consult with the people who are going to be affected most by the decisions that we're making? It makes no sense to me that we wouldn't do it. It's just such a modest proposal. It's being made out and demonised in a way that is so unhelpful and so divisive and so unnecessary. That's the bit I just don't get.
But it's modest on one level and generous, driven by great generosity from the people who wrote that statement together, 250. But on the other hand, it has the potential to be immensely powerful and effective, because there is no greater expression of democracy available to us in this country than a referendum. Yes or no. This is a simple proposition, yes or no. And if you vote yes, what you are going to give to the nation, not just to Indigenous people, but to the nation, is continuity of that voice, continuity of representation to Parliament, echoing the voice of a 65,000-year plus continuous civilisation that had custody over this country and managed this country for all those thousands of years, to actually be listened to have a chance, like all of the other great institutions of this country, to grow, to evolve, to reform, to mature, to improve, to actually grow up, and with the integrity that I believe that they would bring to the table, because of the weight of the public voice behind them, they would have a moral and political authority in what they present to government and the Parliament in their representations. And if they are up to the mark, then the onus goes back on government and it goes back on the Parliament to treat them respectfully, take them seriously, give genuine consideration to what they have to say. And then we watch for the results. We watch over time as those gaps shrink and we become a better, fairer nation for it.
I just want to say about the generosity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It is a cultural way. And I'll just explain it like this. Have you all seen the IATSIS map nowadays, with all the different coloured, all the different First Nations, right? Hundreds of First Nations. But what you're also looking at when you look at that map is hundreds of First Nations languages, unique languages, okay? We're not talking dialects, we're talking unique languages. And when you look at how these hundreds of First Nations, all together on this one common continent, could have unique languages, it goes to this point, that we must have been masters of dispute resolution. We must have understood how to make peace. For these languages to evolve so uniquely, we must have understood how to make peace. Now, there's a word in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, makarata, which is a Yolngu word for the coming together after a struggle, a dispute resolution process. And so all of these nations would have had a similar word and a similar process. We weren't conquerors of each other's lands. We understood how to make peace. And that is what we are offering here again. We are offering to make peace in a modest way, in a meaningful way, in a way that is going to see all of us go forward as a nation for a better future.
I would encourage you to come up to the microphone if you'd like to ask a question. We'll only have time for a few, so don't hold back. I just want to make a couple of points before we move on. One is, as Kerry's talking about all of the different Indigenous organisations that they've been over the years, as I've been researching this, one point of fact that I came across was that the first one was a Whitlam-initiated organisation that was started in the year of my birth, 1972. That's 50 years ago.
Yep.
So to suggest that this is sort of a sudden whim or a flippant exercise is patently ridiculous. The other thing is that in the various pieces of literature that are around, one is a book by Megan Davis on the Uluru Statement, which speaks to the process of Uluru. The one thing that those various groups of Indigenous people all agreed on that was unanimous was the voice. So to suggest that this is a Canberra voice, again, is just a complete furphy. Mon's got control of the Slido, but since we have someone at the microphone, I'll go to you first. Please state your name and keep your questions short, if you don't mind.
Hello, my name's Helen. There's a lot of coverage of the No campaign, which means it must be a very well-funded strategy. I'm really interested in who is funding the No campaign and what you think their motivation might be.
Kerry, you got the floor.
Kerry.
Well, it's still, I've watched journalists raise that question as well, and I haven't seen too many of them answer it. I mean, various names get thrown up. My impression is that whatever weight of money they may have, it doesn't actually constitute a significant number of people. And the problem about social media, or one of the issues in social media, is that a single voice can be amplified. And you can have a scenario where there's this sound that's coming at you, which can sound like multiple voices, but can actually not be that many. The other thing about the No campaign is this. I think we've seen just about every shot they can fire. And that includes the bullshit. And so I think as the weeks wear on, I think that those arguments are going to continue to wear thinner, and I think they're already looking ragged. I'm personally disappointed as a journalist, and I don't make a practice of bagging my own trade, my own former colleagues, and I'm not being universal about it. I think there is some fine journalism being practiced around the reporting of The Voice. But I think also that I think there's been some lazy reporting, and I think that things are being missed. I think the No campaign has largely got away with blue murder. And I don't expect the Australian media to become flag wavers for the Yes campaign. I absolutely do not. But I do expect crap to be called out. And I'm not seeing it done in a way that I would regard as good journalism. But to come back to the individuals, look, I think the motivations, I think when you're talking about the political aspect of this, I think the motivation is to land blows on the Albanese government. And that if this referendum goes down, I think there's an assumption from some of those leading the No campaign that will land a mark on the Albanese government and may bring them back to the field, which I think is I'll stop slightly short of saying despicable, but I do think that that diminishes the quality of our politics in this country even more than it has been diminished in the past, which has led, amongst other things, to a number of teal members of the parliament. But I think that the bright spot is going to be the increasing evidence of more and more people coming to the fore, individual Australians putting their shoulder to the wheel, tens of thousands of volunteers already, and that is growing exponentially. I think you're going to see the weight of that and the evidence of that, and anybody who underestimates, who thinks that this is going to be won with dirty tricks in social media alone, has got another thing coming, because I think that there is a real weight of a kind of army, if you like, out there, spreading the word of truth. And stick to the truth if you're going to be a part of this. Be truthful. And wear the truth with pride, because that is what's going to win this campaign.
So, Thomas, you and I have had a direct experience of this. I know you've had a lot of direct experience of this, but you and I recorded a podcast some time ago in which we talked about a range of issues. There was a grab taken out of that podcast that was used out of context and in fact edited in a strategic way to try to intimate that Indigenous people were trying to get their hands on everyone's superannuation. It's quite bizarre. But within that context, you've been sort of tagged as a radical activist. You've been sort of dragged through some of the press in a pretty negative light. How do you respond to that sort of approach and continue?
With great class.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, it's disappointing. And I mean, some of those video clips that they've taken, the podcast was one, and that was, completely taken out of context. That was really dishonest. But others were, when in passionate moments responding to the terrible things that are happening in my communities, another death in custody, or, and so, look, I admit they were moments of passion, where you're really upset and you're, and I was talking about things that this voice is not, though, right? I mean, this is a voice that is advisory to the Parliament, that is about effecting change and enhancing our democracy. But it is hard, There was a cartoon yesterday, I don't know if many of you saw it.
Hard to miss.
Just terribly racist things. And I was thinking when Kerry...
defamatory.
Yeah, and I was thinking when Kerry was talking about this pattern that we see as well, right? That this is a sort of scaremongering that has gone on before. That somehow people are going to lose their backyards, or farmers are going to lose their farms if Indigenous people, get a bit of a say and a bit of decency in this system. All of this fear-mongering is nothing new. But you know what it is? It goes to that this is trying to land a political blow here. And who is the fodder in this? Again, it's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and our lives. And this debate, about this modest proposal in itself shows the reason why we should have a voice that is guaranteed to speak for ourselves.
With respect to everyone who's submitted a question on Slido, we have a long queue at the microphone. Please come forward, state your name, keep your questions short, and we'll try to get through a few questions, guys, so keep your answers fairly to the point. Thank you.
Okay. My name is Anne. I've got two quick questions. First, why aren't we making more of the fact that there is a voice in many other countries? I think of the Nordic countries and Canada. And that would show that it's not such a big, dramatic, radical proposal. My second question is, I have a lot of friends who are inclined to vote no. Good, decent people, not the people that we've been discussing tonight. And they say things like, it's going to cost a lot of money. How do people like me respond to that?
Thomas, thank you.
Yes. So firstly, I was hoping Kerry was going to answer that. I can't remember what the first part, sorry.
We'll take the first one, then handball.
Sorry, I'm a bit lost tonight.
Kerry. The issue of money. Start with the billions of dollars of money that have been wasted. Not by Indigenous people. Not by Indigenous people, but through faulty policy that came from Parliament House and the bureaucratic environs around it. Marcia Langton, one of the great advocates on behalf of her people over many decades, a truly eminent Australian, talked in the committee hearings that Thomas and I attended a couple of months ago in the Parliament, talked about the scores and scores of communities that she and Tom Karma and others visited when they were putting together their co-design process for what kind of shape a voice might take. And she said again and again and again in those communities, people talked about the fly-in, fly-out bureaucrats who came and took copious notes and made all sorts of promises and pretended to listen and said that they would come back. What came back was policies that failed because they didn't listen, or nothing came back at all. So when people talk about lots of money, this is not going to be a massive bureaucracy. There'll be further consultations with Indigenous Australians. about what final shape that voice might take. But Indigenous people aren't going to be any more interested in it than anybody else in a bulky, bloated body to represent them. They want results, they want credibility, they want integrity. And the Parliament will determine that. So this is not something where somehow behind the scenes Indigenous people pull strings and bucket loads of money suddenly flow back out to them, which then gets wasted. It's just rubbish. I mean, this stuff is childish. It is childish. I don't blame the people who are raising this question, honest people trying to work it out for themselves. I do hold responsible the people who know better, but nonetheless are spreading the poison.
I would just...
And what was the other one?
Yeah, no, and you know, I would just say that also add, you know, like talk about how exactly what Kerry was talking about, but, you know, the voice is about efficiencies, you know, it is about better results. We've got to explain to people that this is about actually holding the bureaucracy to account, you know, and where there's, if you could just imagine this with me, you know, where there's programs that are failing and wasteful, then the voice is about raising awareness about that and seeing those programs, you know, addressed. Where programs are really, and policies are really effective in one part of the country, then the voice can raise that, you know, and help to see that implemented everywhere else, you know. So it's about improving things, and with that, you know, it will ultimately save money because it'll be better outcomes for every dollar spent.
There's a perfect example in the book of how good policy can work, and it was COVID. The most vulnerable, distinguishable body of people in this country were Indigenous Australians, particularly in regional and rural Australia. Guess who came out of it best in terms of numbers? Indigenous people, because Indigenous people not only had a voice, they ran the response. In many parts of Australia, they ran the response. And the statistics of deaths and serious illness and serious disruption in those communities were way lower than in so much more of the rest of the country where our state and federal governments together were running things. Now, that is one really simple illustration that is demonstrable and easy to prove, and there are other illustrations in the book like it. And if that's not an effective way of persuading people, I don't know what is, because it's the reality.
I'm going to take a couple of questions and then get them answered. If you'd like to come forward and just ask your question.
I'm Judy Bisland, and this question relates to the two that have been asked previously, but my husband and I have a number of friends who formed their view no quite early, and there wasn't a lot of information at that time, apart from us giving our best arguments to them. I guess what I'm really concerned about is trying to find the strategies that will help those people who formed their ideas negatively early on, urged on by the right-wing press and, you know, and political parties, how we can reach them. Like, they're not going to come to a kitchen table discussion. I don't know whether we need to coordinate a letter writing, you know, to the right-wing papers and media to get the alternative view. But I think some major strategies are needed, because I think quite a few people did form a negative opinion early.
Thank you. I'll get you to come forward and ask your question, see if we can get some common themes here.
Hey, thanks for the discussion tonight. I think I, like most people in the room from the straw poll before...
Can you just be a little closer?
I, like most people in the room, support the voice and I think want to help. So last year when I signed up to help in the federal election for the Teal campaigns, it was very efficient, effective system. By contrast, I've been trying to sign up for months for the Yes campaign and had no responses, and I know many people who are in the same boat. So I guess my question is quite simple, but just how can we help?
Okay, thank you very much. Would you like to come forward?
My name's Felicity. I'm nervous. what is going to be done to inform the people in the outback? I heard on the radio or television the other day that half the people don't even know what it is. So I'm wondering what strategy is going to be implemented to make sure that the people who it's going to affect most can make an informed decision. Second thing I just want to say quickly is I've been on a lived experience advisory team for mental health. There's been a massive change here in Victoria with the Royal Commission into Mental Health. I have a son with schizophrenia. It has been a effing maze and lack of system to get help for him. And this large mental health organisation wants to listen to carers and listen to consumers to find out how to best shape the system for the future. And it's incredibly empowering for someone who's been through years and years of hell to be able to help form a new system. I know I'm going a bit off track, but there's a massive analogy there, don't you think?
Listen.
Even though I'm going off track. Finally, did anyone see Tony Abbott last night trying to scare people about the Constitution? I was in the Queenscliff Historical Society last week. I was talking about the history of the area, indigeneity, and I said to the woman, there's got to be a yes vote. And she said, oh no, I'm voting no.
I'm going to stop you. Thank you.
Because of the Constitution. So I want to understand what is going to happen with the Constitution.
I will just hold you there if you don't mind. There's a couple of things there. So the first two were about how to change people who took a position in the first instance, how to convince them, how to change their minds. And then the second piece of that was how to actually join up to support the process.
Well, look, that is exactly why we've written the book, and we've written the book to help people whose instinct might be to vote yes, but who are worried about how to explain it to others who are going to argue with them because they've felt some confusion about what shape it might be and so on. We've also written it to help people who really don't know whether they should vote yes or no, but they're genuine in that, and they're committed enough at least to want to know more. The other thing is that we've already found anecdotally, and it's not just about the book, but it's one illustration, that people's minds can be reached, people's emotions can be reached without manipulation. But we've had a lot of anecdotal evidence, and Thomas and I have been to every capital city, we've been to some of the regional centres, we've been to many meetings like this. Thomas has been to a lot more. And we've heard quite a bit of anecdotal evidence where people have just said, look, my grandfather, my father, my grandfather, my auntie, my sister, my brother, my father wants to vote no, or wanted to vote no. And I showed him the book, or I read the book, and I talked to him about it. He changed his mind. She changed her mind. They changed their minds. So there's been a superficiality about this which has not been really penetrated. And I find it frustrating because of what's at stake. Do not underestimate your capacity to be a big part of this. Think of yourselves as part of an army, not military, but an army of voices. We can, without becoming zealots, we can help make this happen. And whether it's kitchen tables, whether it's in your own family, whether it's your neighbourhood, the person over the fence, Thomas will tell you, don't try to argue the toss with people who are rusted on, minds made up, going to vote no, come hell or high water. Don't get into nasty arguments. Be civil. Take the high road. It's the right road. And don't lose confidence, because it's not just the safety in numbers. It's why I like the kitchen table concept, because you can have others with you. And we've seen how that has worked against the odds. You know, we as a nation are better than what we're seeing. We are better than what we're seeing. We saw it with the marriage equality debate, a plebiscite that didn't even need to happen, but when it did, look at the outcome. And look at the scaremongering that took place around that, and look at the outcome again. Look at how much better we feel about ourselves as a result. Look at how much unhappiness and discord was disposed of in that moment. It can happen again. This nation can be made a great deal stronger. We can all stand a little straighter. We can all look the other countries of the world a little clearer and directly in the eye, for good reason.
So during our election campaign, Cathy McGowan, of course, the mother of the movement, as I call her, has a mantra which is, if you talk to 10 people, they 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 talk to 10 people, and that's how you win a community independent campaign. And that's what Monique and I both did, and that's what we need to translate to the voice. Mon, I know you're going to talk at the end about our sort of call to action, but do you want to add something more to what Kerry said then?
I think everyone just needs to do what they can do. And a lot of people are, we're door knocking in Kooyong and we're going to door knock elsewhere once we've done with Kooyong. But a lot of people feel really nervous about that. We've had people call us and say, we'd like to help, but we don't know what to do. We'd like to give you some money. What would you do with it? And we've said, look, we bought a huge number of copies of your book. It takes, not to be, it's actually very short, a couple of hours to read it. My husband just texted me earlier, we had our next door neighbour over the other night. She's an elderly lady, she was unsure. She read the book, she's dropped the book back to us today and said, I've changed my mind. I'm voting yes.
Yeah.
That's what we need to do.
Yeah.
And social licence is important. Putting up the signs. We've got signs. We'll give people signs. Putting up the signs builds that social licence to say, well, I'm declaring myself. I believe in this. It's important. It gives people the poke to think about it, and it gives them a chance to talk about it.
Yep.
So it is up to us. We have to do it, but we all have to do it in the way that feels most comfortable to us.
Thomas, I want to come back to you just before I go to these last questions about remote communities. That was the other question that was asked. How to reach Indigenous Australians in remote communities to make sure they can be involved, understand?
Yeah, we're working really hard on that. The thing about the reports in the media about this lately is that you could go into any community. You could probably go into Kooyong and find someone that doesn't know, who the elected member of parliament is, right?
No.
I doubt that.
Not a good example. But anyway, no, this is the case. We're working hard on that. We're going to try and reach every single remote community in the country in the final few months, and we've reached many. You might have saw the Barunga Voice Declaration in the Northern Territory recently, where the land councils came together, hundreds of representatives, democratically elected representatives for land matters, came together and declared, that they really want the rest of Australia to vote yes for this, because they don't want to see their voice taken away at the stroke of a pen again, because they felt the brunt of the Northern Territory intervention back in 2007. They don't want to be standing alone. And so we can be confident that well over 80% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people support this, from polling, from the processes, the multiple processes that have run their course. So that support is there, and we're going to try and reach everyone though still.
Thank you. And there is a bunch of material down in the foyer, and Mon and my teams are down there to help support what you need in terms of getting involved. I'll take these last 3 questions and we'll try and get through them in the next few minutes. Thank you, sir.
Hello, my name is David Freeman. My question is about the constitutional law associated with this change. The change gives special privileges to one group of Australian citizens that will not apply to any other group of Australian citizens. How is that consistent with the principle of equality in the Constitution? And I know about the race segment of the Constitution, completely unrelated to my question.
Thank you, David.
Can I
Kerry?
tackle that one
yes,
more here?
please.
Well, let me put it this way. Take somebody like Rupert Murdoch.
I'd rather not.
Rupert Murdoch has a special voice. People like Rupert Murdoch, as we know, can lift the phone and get to the Prime Minister of Australia. And it's not just, I'm saying a Rupert Murdoch, I'm using him as an example. Powerful people in this country and powerful vested in this country have their own pathways to power. They don't have to be in the Constitution because they've got the power and the influence to do it. And a lot of that power and influence comes from just the sheer weight of money. Right? So that's that. I'll answer the rest of your question by quoting the person that Peter Dutton, Leader of the Opposition, handpicked to be his spokesman on his front bench on Indigenous affairs, and that was a man named Julian Leeser. And when Peter Dutton told his party room that the opposition was going to oppose the Voice, Julian Leeser, on a matter of principle, resigned from the front bench because he remains a supporter of the Voice. And this is what he said in the Parliament about 3 to 4 weeks ago when he was explaining his position. And when he spoke about and this is a man who has spent many, many years working on, studying, thinking about these issues, including the constitutional one. And he said, it is not going to create 2 levels of people. It is not. It is not going to lead to a huge bureaucracy. It is going to close the gap. Now, Thomas and I again sat in those parliamentary committee processes and listened to a former Chief Justice of the High Court in Robert French, another highly respected former High Court judge in Kenneth Hayne, 2 of this country's preeminent constitutional academic lawyers, and probably the most prominent silk who spends his life in front of the High Court, all with close, intimate knowledge of our Constitution and of constitutional law and legal practice. And every one of them dispatched the fear about how the law was going to be somehow subverted by this simple process of giving Indigenous people, the oldest continuous culture in the world and the first inhabitants of this country, an opportunity in the Constitution to simply make representations to the Parliament. Now, you might call that a privilege. I would call it a right for that particular... And I'm probably saying this with some passion. I'm not attempting for a minute to denigrate your opinion. I'm really not. I certainly respect your right to say it, and I respect you for having the guts to stand up and say it.
Agree completely. Thank you for asking the question.
I just want to add. David, I know you mentioned you don't want to talk about the race power in this, section 5126 of the Constitution, but it can't be ignored in this conversation because it has been used only for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Special decisions are made about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people using the race power. And in the 1990s, there was the Hindmarsh case. And the Hindmarsh case determined that special power, the power to make special laws about a race of people that has been used for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the Hindmarsh case found that it could be used to discriminate to our detriment, not necessarily to our benefit, okay? And on the matter of special treatment or special, there's been an omission of our people from being heard in this. Decisions are made about us without us being heard. And decisions are made about us. And so if decisions are going to be made about us, then we should have a say. It's just a matter of fairness.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm going to take these last 2 questions very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you. My question relates to the effect of the Voice. In particular, in the Kalma-Langton report, it identifies that Parliament will be obliged to consult the Voice on specific legislation, including the Native Title Act. And I'm wondering how you would like to see that Act advance in terms of addressing dispossession.
Thank you. Please come forward and ask your question, ma'am.
Actually, I don't want to ask a question. I just want to make a quick comment. I'm a member of a local reconciliation group and we've been giving some talks about the Voice. When people say, how much is this going to cost the taxpayers? My reply is, any wealth we have in Australia is because we took the country from the First Nations people.
I'll do a Tony Jones and take that as comment. So, obliged to consult was the point that was made in the previous question. Kerry, do you have a response to that?
Well, I mean, in particular on native title, I think truly it's not a matter of what I want or anybody else individually might want. We're talking about having an institution and a process. And so the voice, you know, the talk about them getting involved in frivolous claims, do you honestly think that people who are elected by marginalised Indigenous communities are going to want to go off in games of frolic? How long would they last in their communities? They'd last 5 minutes. Their integrity is going to be at stake here, you know? And the people who are going to be elected are people who will want to see change affected for the better for those Indigenous communities they're representing. So they're going to have their time cut out, really. Just think of just the really basics: health, education, employment, infrastructure. On those things alone, and an obligation to listen. I hope so. But it's not an obligation to say, "Oh, is that what you want? Okay, we'll sign that into law." That's not what's happening. But an obligation to listen. I would have thought that these two people here have an obligation to listen to their constituents. That's all these Indigenous people are asking for. They want the Parliament of this country and the elected governments of this country to feel obliged to listen to what they have to say in a measured way, to listen to it, think seriously about it, along with their bureaucrats and their policymakers, and listen to what makes sense in the context of what those policies are, and where they believe, where they have been convinced that there is a place for those suggestions, they make them. What is wrong with that?
I think that's the importance of this going to a referendum, right? I mean, it's the Australian people saying to all future parliaments to give us the respect of listening to us when they make decisions about us. That's what it is. That's the great thing about this moment in time, that you guys get to have a say.
And on that note, before we close, I'm going to ask Thomas to recite the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
Okay, thanks. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished, and it coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise, that a peoples possessed the land for 60 millennia and this sacred link should disappear from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alien from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish, they will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, everyone. I'm going to ask Mon for some final words before we close.
It's up to us. We have to do this. You know, the cavalry aren't coming, we are the cavalry. We need your help. We can make Australia a better country. We can make it better for our kids. We can improve things. Every time I hear Thomas recite the Uluru Statement, when he uses the phrase, the torment of our powerlessness, it gives me chest pain. We need to change this. We have the ability to do it, and we have to do it together. I can't speak for Zoe. I know that there are frustrations with groups like Yes 23. My team is a small team, but we're building, we've got volunteers, we've got stuff on our website, we've got merchandise, we want to share it. We want to give people the benefit of what we have, the publications, the core flutes, the stickers, the T-shirts. We will train people to door knock in their own communities. We will do Zooms. We're starting a thing where we just get people into a room. We want to talk to the people who aren't convinced, who are going to vote no. We want to have a respectful discussion about the questions that they have. We don't want to proselytise. We don't want to lecture to them. We're not going to use the R word, because that's not what we need to do. We need to be respectful about something which is so important to us as a country. But we need help, because there's only a small number of us. But together as communities, we've seen what we can do. And so we're asking people to come to us. We'll work it out somehow. We'll get people together. We'll take to the streets of Melbourne, and we will effect a change. And if we do that, I think we will be part of something incredibly special.
Thank you, Mon. So, as I mentioned earlier, our teams are in the foyer. We are here to help. We do need help, but we are here to help facilitate this to create great change for our country. We appreciate all of you being here tonight. Thomas and Kerry will be here to sign books. Books are there. The signing table is on that side. I would ask none of you to leave because we want to get a photo. But before we do that, I will just read a quote. It's actually from Thomas, sitting right next to me, but I think it says something about where we're at, which is, "It is true that Australians believe in fairness, but the final stretch of this uphill battle will be steeper than ever, and those devils on the shoulder whisper confusion as we toil. How can we quit now, after decades of advocacy before Uluru, aimed at moulding this constitutional proposition into one both safe and powerful, symbolic and practical, true to its intent to just give Indigenous peoples the decency of a say? When we reach the peak of the mountain, we will see the full vista of who we can be. It will no longer be an obscured view of our country." Thank you for coming, everyone.
Thank you,
and
Rod.
stay put for a photo.